Professor Steve Keen recently retired from the position of Head of Economics, History and Politics at the Kingston University in London. Since then, he is the first the first grant-funded economist via the Patreon webpage, and I think it's we're more than 8,000 patrons.
Oh no, dollars, not patrons.
Oh, pardon me. Yeah. Okay.
About 1,000,
Right.
1,100 patrons.
Yeah. Okay. Before his time in London, he was professor at the West Sydney University from 1996 to 2013, where he taught economic thought, methodology, behavioral finance, and macroeconomics. In March 27, he started his Debt Watch blog to warn of the impending financial crisis. He was among the few economists who correctly predicted the financial crisis, the Great Recession, and the great moderation that preceded this crisis since 1982. If you remember, the stock market shortly after March 27 crashed. It was December 2007. Professor Keen's main achievement is, and you will see it here today, the development of a system dynamics modeling software for economics named Minsky, as Hyman Minsky, the great economist. What is outstanding to that system dynamics model is that it is simple, but it includes complex feedbacks between systems in a not equilibrium way. It provides an alternative to classic DSGE models that are based on the view that the economy is floating through time in perfect equilibrium and crises only occur due to exogenous supply or demand shocks. Exogenous in this sense means that a crisis couldn't be foreseen or prevented by economists. So economists are always there when are responsible if the Neoclassical economists, when the economy is running well, but when it crashes, it's an exogenous shock. In the second section of his talk, named Deriving Macroeconomics from Incontrovertible Foundations, Professor Steve Keen will show that this equilibrium behavior is exactly not what can be described as a capitalist market economy. That capitalist market economy works in a different way, a non-equilibrium way. He will also show that financial crisis from mainstream economists described as exogenous shocks can be derived by modeling of system interaction and can be simulated ex ante. Now we're coming to the first section of his talk. It's about integrating economics and ecology, and he will show how the role of energy in production should be incorporated in economic forecast and how this affects climate change prediction. Regarding schedule, with 45 minutes time for each section of the talk, and between the two sections there will be time for your comments and questions. Well, thanks.
Thank you, Alexander. Okay.
Oh, pardon me. I just forget one special guest and visitor today. I invited Paul Steinhardt. He's the publishing editor of the German publishing company Macroeconomic. They're publishing books about heterodox economics, and they have an online blog, mostly in German, but some articles are in English, as far as I remember. And I'll pass through some of the books, and of course the books from publications from Macroeconomic, and of course the famous book from Steve Keen, Debunking Economics, in its second edition, isn't it?
Second, yeah.
Yeah, of course. On the third, she's still writing.
Indeed. Okay.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to be taking 2 points now. Because they're such different points, I think we should have discussion after I finish the first one. The first is talking about bringing energy into economics, and the second is the significance of including the fact which central banks are now acknowledging that bank lending creates money, which is something which textbooks still largely deny, and then show that it's... I recognise the importance of having sound foundations for economics, macroeconomics, but I'm going to argue macroeconomics itself gives us that foundation, not microeconomics. So looking at why should we incorporate energy into models of production? We all, Cobb-Douglas production functions dominate the Neoclassical modelling, Leontief ones dominate post-Keynesian, they both ignore energy. Why should we include it? Well, I think that probably the best reason was given back in the 1920s by Arthur Eddington, who was a populist, both a leading physicist. He's the person who confirmed Einstein's general relativity by observing the curving of light around the sun and measuring it and getting it exactly Einstein's equations. And also, but he's a bit like a Stephen Hawking for our time, and so both as a developer and a populariser. He said, if you have a theory that contradicts Maxwell's equations, well, that's, as Einstein himself did, so much for Maxwell. If you find that observations contradict your theory, well, it could be because it's bungled by bad experiments. He said, but if it contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There's nothing for it to do but to collapse in deepest humiliation. Now that, frankly, is the state of economics, and not just neoclassical. I normally attack neoclassical economics, as you're probably all aware. This applies equally to the post-Keynesian school. We haven't yet done it properly. And if you look at why do we have to do it, again, I'm no expert on thermodynamics. I'm working with experts on that now to extend the work I'm going to show you here. But the basic laws are, first of all, conservation. You can neither create nor destroy energy. You simply use what's available in the universe. And the second, and that is actually described by a wonderful joke analogy by Arthur Ginsberg, the beat poet from America in the 60s and 70s. And he said his summary of the first law is, you can't win. The second law says entropy, disorder increases over time. You go from high frequency, well organised, to low frequency, less well organised, and so on. So disorder, the colloquial way, disorder increases over time. And Ginsberg translation of that is, you can't break even. And the third law says that, well, if you could find somewhere in the universe that was at absolute zero, you could dump all the energy, the waste into there and use all the available energy. And the third law is there is no such place. Okay? And Ginsberg's summary for that is, you can't leave the game. So you can't break even, you can't win, you can't break even, you can't leave the game. Those are the rules of thermodynamics. So what that means is, if you have a closed system, it must degrade over time. Now, we see the Earth doing anything, in terms of the economy, doing anything but. Production and economic growth means increasing order over time. We have more outputs and inputs every year. The outputs themselves are more ordered than the inputs themselves. We turn iron ore and coal into iron and steel. So for that to be happening, we must be using an external source of energy. The Earth is an open system, and we have to acknowledge that in our economic modelling, or we're doing modelling which, again, without even talking about what might be the flaws within those models, should collapse in deepest humiliation, according to people who know their physics. So we have a local decrease in entropy driven by exploiting free energy, free meaning we didn't create it, it simply exists, and we actually at the same time causing a global increase in entropy, again because to do work you must have more disorder being created than the order out of work. So all our existing models violate those laws of thermodynamics, which is not a good start for what's trying to call itself a science. Now, if you look at where they began, Cobb-Douglas was pretty much the first mathematical model of production, and you had inputs of labour and capital producing output with constant returns to scale, so I'm sure that's an equation. How many modelers are in this room, by the way? Just if you put your hands up if you develop economic models. Not a lot, okay, but nonetheless some, okay. That's the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is the default model for neoclassical modelling. The default for post-Keynesians is called the Leontief production function, has output as a minimum of either a capital and output ratio or labour and labour productivity. Now they both ignore the role of energy in production. And they see effectively production as a function of putting labour and capital together. And there have been some attempts to bring energy in as a third input. And that's Stiglitz did it, Solo had it in a set of early papers. My colleague Bob Ayres developed what's called the Linux model, where that was a stage in developing the overall model. So if you put it in Cobb-Douglas form, what you then add is just another term, which is E, and to get constant returns to scale, you have K to the alpha, L to the beta, E to the 1 minus alpha minus beta. Well, that's better, okay? But if you use the same guidelines that are used by Cobb-Douglas modelers to decide what the exponent should be, which is pretty much basing it on the share in income or the share in production of those three factors, then you're going to give a very low value for 1 minus alpha minus beta of about 0.07. That's roughly the 70% being the share of energy in GDP in general. And what that would mean is if you had a 10% fall in energy from current levels, you'd only get a 0.7% fall in GDP. Now I hope that has you doing saying this doesn't pass the smell test, which is the classic expression that Bob Solo used to describe DSG models in general some time ago. But this, as I said, this applies to the post-Keynesian view as well. Now a 90% fall in energy, way down there, would cause only a 15% fall in output. There's something seriously wrong with that vision. The empirical impact simply has to be higher. Something is wrong with our models, and that's what they tell us is the role of energy. And it still implies, the equation itself, you could still set those parameters so that alpha plus beta equals 1, so you can have output with no energy input, which again is intellectually wrong. So what I realised, and this is literally the thought bubble that popped into my head that let me resolve this issue, a machine without energy is a sculpture. A person without energy is a corpse. Okay? Actually, I was walking through a friend's house full of sculptures, and that's when that vision came. The friend being Bob Ayres, who spent most of his life trying to bring energy into economics and developing a whole range of reasons which are all tend to be ignored. So I was very glad to have this thought occur to me when I was working with Bob. So it's quite simple. Rather than saying energy is a separate input, it's an input that each of labour and capital need to be able to do anything in the first place. And equally, you can't add energy independently of labour or capital to a production process. That's effectively like thinking you walk past a factory, throw in a bomb and create products. It just doesn't happen. Energy has to be channeled by labour and capital. So it's the critical input without which they don't function. And the simplest way to acknowledge this is to say, let's break L of E, that function, down into the number of workers, and I'll just go through this for each variable, the number of unskilled labour units for labour, the energy inputs, which tens of thousands of watts in terms of the amount of energy we absorb as modern humans versus the tiny amount our predecessors got a couple of hundred years ago, and the fraction of that that's turned into useful work in manufacturing. Okay. And then the same thing in machinery. The number of machines, I've got inverted commas around the units because of course there are measurement problems there. The energy inputs to the representative machine, and that's grown from trivial levels at the start of the Industrial Revolutions to enormous levels today. And then the efficiency with which that's converted into useful work. Now once you do that, let's look at them in a bit more detail. It's easy to measure the number of unskilled labour hours put in. It should be unskilled rather than all labour. The product represents the useful work that a worker can do in terms of energy, and that hasn't changed since the days of Cro-Magnon man. Okay, we've got roughly 90 watts capacity to put work in for about 8 hours a day. Our basal rate is equivalent to slightly less than an incandescent light bulb. We can work at twice that rate for a short part of the day and then we need to recuperate. That hasn't changed, so I can treat that as a constant. Now for the machinery side of things, there's measurement issues with capital which have been ignored by economic theory for a long time, but we can, I think, take them seriously in a more productive way now. And of course, post-Keynesians criticise neoclassicals for using K, but they use K as well. Okay, so again, I say this is a critique that applies to both schools. Now, the energy that the representative machine absorbs has risen dramatically over time. My favourite example is to compare the Watt steam engine, and James Watt's steam engine consumed roughly 10 tonnes of coal per day, to Elon Musk's Falcon 9, which consumes roughly the same amount per second. So something in the order of 20,000 times more energy for what you might call the, not the representative machine, but the outstanding machine of its time. And the efficiency of which that's converted into from energy into work, in the case of those two ideas from energy to movement, fluctuates with the cost of energy, the business cycle, and so on, but it's obviously less between 0 and 1. Now, when you feed that into the Cobb-Douglas production function, leaving out the A term for the moment, what you get is the original Cobb-Douglas over here. That is therefore the equivalent of the A term in the Cobb-Douglas production function. This is a constant, which I'll just call the Greek L. And that's, so the overall, the term we call A in the Cobb-Douglas production function, which has got all sorts of strange interpretations behind it, you know, Higgs neutral, technical change, etc., that is actually, when you look at it, the contribution to output of the standard machine for its time. So there's numerous improvements by bringing this in to the Cobb-Douglas production function over what we currently use. First of all, energy is now vital. In the previous example, and I showed you the L to the alpha, K to the beta, E to the 1 minus alpha minus beta, you could set the value for the exponent for energy to 0 without affecting the other two. Now if you set the exponent for energy to 0, you also set the exponent for capital to 0, and you're working with labour theory of value, which I don't think anybody in this room would want to use. Okay? So energy is vital now. You also explain the solo residual because that's measuring the contribution of the representative machine to output. And of course that's going to be responsible for something like 85 or 90% of change in output. And crucially, for looking at the green finance that I know is a major focus on the ECB these days, it's compatible, this equation is compatible with the laws of thermodynamics. So in this thing, I don't think this is negotiable. I think we have to be using equations like this, particularly given the state of the global climate, the global economy. We simply have to be bringing ourselves up to date with the laws of thermodynamics. Now, when you look at why this is the case, the energy inputs, so the number of machines times the energy per machine, the number of workers times the energy per worker, and that's the 25,000 watts or so we consume as a person living in a developed country these days. That's necessarily less than the outputs are necessarily less than the inputs because that exergy to energy ratio is much less than 1. So that gap is the first approximation to the waste we generate from production. Now, of course, that gives us a link between economics and ecology, but it's complicated because the waste we dump is not predominantly heat energy, which would just radiate into outer space were it not for the carbon dioxide we're dumping in the atmosphere at the same time. So the main form that waste takes is material. And there's quite a bit of work to consider how do we do the conversion from the energy, starting from an equation working in energy, across to something working in terms of mainly matter being the waste we generate. And of course, even the things we consume become waste at a later stage. So all this is being dumped into the environment. So that's the ecology link. There's also a way to redefine GDP. Now I know you've all had discussions, you must have had discussions about how inappropriate GDP is. One of my biologist friends said economics must be the only profession that adds together its assets and liabilities and calls it something productive. You don't want to add car accidents to transportation, but at the moment we do. Well, this equation redimensions GDP in terms of energy, useful work. So it's a positive definition for GDP. And in that situation, you would be deducting traffic accidents, congestion from GDP, not adding them to it as we currently do. Now it also, because the exponent has gone from 0.07 using the cost share theorem to 0.3 using the same theorem, then now we're getting a more significant role for energy. So in this case, if you had a 10% fall in energy, that would cause a 3.5% fall in GDP. So it's 5 times as significant just by acknowledging that machines need energy to do work. But there's a very good argument that it should be much higher, of the order of 2/3. And the argument is made very well by Greg Mankiw in this paper, The Growth of Nations. So you can easily download this later. That's a link to the paper. He did a review of the whole theory of growth and pointed out some serious problems with the usual setting that we use for alpha and 1 minus alpha. You said if you feed those into Cobb-Douglas, into looking at data from different countries, within each country it appears to make sense in terms of the distribution of income. But between countries, you get wildly wrong answers out of it. So when you look at the normal equation, you could explain differences in income between countries of roughly 2. So India's income should be half America's income. You said it's actually closer to 10. There's a major disparity between what the model can predict and what the data tells us. It also predicts convergence growth rates about twice as high as we actually observe. But the real punchline, I think, is this one. Again, the logic is in Mankyu's paper. I can't reproduce it straight away, but I highly recommend taking a look at it. You would get a 100, with 1/10 of the income, the returns to capital should be 100 times as high. So in other words, the profit rate, which is say 10% in the West, should be 1,000% in poor countries. That's just nonsense. Okay? There's something seriously wrong with those figures. So how do we square this with the fact that it gives such good results in terms of distribution of income? And I don't know how many of you have seen these papers. I'm going to mention the key author is a guy called Anwar Sheikh with a paper called The Humbug Production Function, satirising the Cobb-Douglas production function. Macombi and Philippe are others who worked in this area. What they show is if you start with the distribution of income as data, so output is divided into either profits or wages, and then presume a uniform wage rate and a uniform profit rate, then if you divide through by GDP, you can now express this in terms of rates of change. And I'm multiplying by L over L, W over W, as you can see, of each term, so I can do another little conversion here and rearrange that equation into income shares and rates of change. So what I've now got in terms of each of these cases, I've got, that's of course the wages share in GDP, that's the profit share in GDP, that's the rate of change of labour, rate of change of wages, rate of change of capital, rate of change of the rate of profit. Substitute those terms in there and call them alpha and 1 minus alpha, because that's the distribution of income now, and I'm going to assume they're relatively constant so I can integrate and take them outside the integral. So I can now express this as a differential of logs. So the differential of the log of y, and I think you can see what's coming here. Integrate, so I get the logs, take exponentials, I get the Cobb-Douglas production function, where the A term is the multiple of the wage rate raised to the alpha and the rate of profit multiplied to 1 minus alpha. And an increasing wage over time explains why that figure rises over time. This, of course, fluctuates. So the Cobb-Douglas production function is simply a remapping of the income identity. That's all it is. It's no wonder it fits the data well. You're regressing 1 against 1. Now, when you look at the cross-national data and you try to make the equation fit a range of nations, getting the comparative statements correct. And Mankyu noticed that all the problems in doing that come from having alpha, which is the exponent for capital, equal to 1/3. He said if it was 2/3, then all those problems would be solved. Say it was 2/3. And he said, well, the difference in steady state income, if one country has 4 times the saving rate of another, it'll have 16 times the income. So that explains the income disparity between India and America. The rate of convergence confirms what they find empirically, and the predicted return differentials falls from a multiple of 100, which is ridiculous, to a multiple of 3.16, which is within the ballpark. Now, Mankyu proposes an externalities argument and a human capital argument for why that exponent should be higher. But what I've shown you in terms of the role of energy now gives you a much better reason for giving a higher value to that exponent, because it now reflects the contribution of energy. So if I now use the coefficient of 2/3 there, then what I find is that energy and the number of machines are far more important than the number of workers in terms of marginal changes. And now a 10% fall in energy fed into this equation gives you a 6.8% fall in output. And that's much more realistic. I think it's probably understating the fall, but it's still much closer to the point than 0.07, which is the previous version, and 3%, which was without the higher coefficient. Now this is all very new work. It's lots and lots of things to be done to extend it further. But the advances, as I've said, it's now compatible with the laws of thermodynamics, which we haven't managed to achieve beforehand. GDP now becomes useful work measured in units of energy. It's necessarily less than the energy input, so we get conformity with the first law and the second law. There's no surplus. We are mining energy and turning it into products. That's what we're doing. So the whole issue over where does the surplus come from is a fallacy, and that applies to Marxian logic as well. So the whole idea of the theory of surplus value, that goes out the window. Okay? I think it clarifies the value debates, which we've really been doing ever since Adam Smith. Waste is absolutely necessary. It has to happen. Again, that's conforming with the second law. And you get a link between economics and ecology at the hip. What generates production on one side of your equation is generating waste on the other. And then you can talk about how much it affects the ecology and so on. So some of the things are necessary. Going through that redefinition, how do we go about it? One way to consider it, we could actually redefine the fundamental needs humans have into a vector description of the energy consumption we have and run that right back to the early industrial era and run it forward to today and see the improvement of living standards that have come out of that energy we're now consuming. We can objectively measure GDP in terms of things, for transport, for example, would be movement of a mass from one point to another in a given time, rather than counting Los Angeles traffic jams as a contribution to GDP, as we currently do. And we could also redo a debate, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, what's called the Cambridge controversies, debating the definition of capital. We're focusing upon the heterogeneity of capital inputs and the impossibility of adding them together, except in Schaffer did the argument using dated labour. But when you think about it, all machines, all of them, are converting fundamentally homogeneous energy into useful work. So that's slightly more homogeneous than the argument that comes out of the Cambridge controversies. We need to build properly linked economic and ecological models. Nordhaus's model does not qualify. That is a dreadful piece of work in my opinion. Regardless whether it's neoclassical or Marxian, the components of that I think are absolutely awful. And the fact that we gave a Nobel Prize for that I think is a travesty for our profession. We need to build models which properly build this feedback between the economy and the ecology, basically an updated version of limits to growth, which was the right way to go about trying to do that. And there's an interesting question. How did it happen that for 200 and something years we've ignored the role of energy in production? In my opinion, the last school of economic thought to properly include energy before the term was invented were the physiocrats. Because according to them, all value resolved to land, and land absorbed the free gift of nature. And they were closer to the truth than we've been ever since Adam Smith. So, I might take any comments and questions at that point and move on to the next one after that. So.
May I?
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. Jacopo Cimalavon from Economics. I think these are very important topics, of course. I'm a macroeconomist myself, and I've been educated, with this orthodox standard way of thinking about macro, which indeed does not consider energy and waste into the picture, and I think it's very important to discuss about that. I find fascinating your concept of useful GDP or useful output. However, it's very difficult to come up with a commonly agreed definition, in my view, of that concept, because how do you define, you in the previous slides you listed some basic human needs that one need to, if I understand correctly, consider in the definition of useful output, useful GDP.
Yeah.
However, it's very arbitrary, like a book is useful or not. There are good books, bad books, like shitty books. So those are part of GDP. This is just to provide an example. So traffic jam, cars are useful or not. If you consider that, if we accept that cars are useful for our well-being, for as a means of transport, then we also need to accept traffic jam as a byproduct of production of cars. So I have a bit of difficulty to understand what you mean by
Well,
useful GDP, useful output, maybe...
I'll give an example. I mean, I think for a start we could look at things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a way of classifying the basic needs of humans. Obviously we need food, shelter, clothing, transportation, entertainment, which is where the good and bad books come in. Whether they're good or bad, they still pass the time. So you define a set of fundamental human needs and then convert those into energy equivalents. Now in terms of transportation, my definition of transportation would be moving, say, your mass from there to the other side of the room in 1 second. How much energy does that take in an absolutely frictionless environment versus how much it would take if you walked, if you're on a skateboard, if you drove in a car, etc., etc. So it is possible to give a very objective measure of all those elements. And you'll actually, I recommend a book called Scale, I've forgotten the author's last name, Jeffrey I think is his first name, but talking about the extent to which we consume and transform energy. Also Vaclav Smel's work. And you'll find that engineers have been measuring that and working out what amount of energy do we consume, but without breaking it down according to needs. So I think we could do that and get to some extent a resolution of the issue about whether you worry about utility maximisation or you don't consider it, which is the post-Keynesian point of view. You could actually say, what amount of energy does somebody from the 17th century consume? And that's their well-being, if you like, measured in energy terms, versus what we consume now. Or look at the people in developing countries versus here, look at change over time. But you'd go from, like with the car, it took me a while to get my head around this as well, by the way. I can understand the reaction. The car is a very cumbersome way of moving from there to there because it weighs 1.5 tons, and most of the weight being moved is the car's weight, not your weight. So those sorts of issues can be clarified.
Can I just quickly...
Yeah, sure.
Very quick follow-up. I mean, you mentioned the example of the car, but like traveling, for example. Now, we know that like travels due to, for example, to low-cost companies have like exponentially increased over the last 10, 20 years. We can now go for very little money everywhere in the world for holidays. So is this, for example, is this part of, is this essential, is this needed or not? And how, this is part of the GDP generated by those companies which allow us to travel everywhere in the world.
I think they are, yeah. I think it's, imagine if you could offer Napoleon the possibility of moving from here to Amsterdam as fast as I moved from Amsterdam to here this morning. He'd give half his army to be able to move that quickly. So we have benefited from this energy consumption we're doing now, and I think we can measure it objectively.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not an economist.
Lucky you.
Yeah, probably. So I think that, and this comes in sort of also with your comment, that why we are forgetting about the laws of thermodynamics and why it has been over a long time been possible to think about growth, is if you look at history, when did the Industrial Revolution start? It was combined with colonialization, and the additional means like rubber, steel, coal were coming, workforce in form of slaves were coming from the colonialized countries. So therefore it was for free. It was disregarded that it's taken from somewhere. Lots of species were eradicated already at that time. So that's I think behind that miracle of getting something out of nothing. Because if you regard that country as nothing and the people living there as nobody, then it can easily happen.
Yeah.
So I just want to make a short summary of your presentation in one sentence. This is what central banks and ECB try to achieve is 3% net growth. That means, first and foremost, 3% higher energy demand minus some efficiency gains, And that what we have been seeing over the last decades is an increase of primary energy demand of around 2% per year. Growth in energy demand. This is what we are contributing to climate change, and this was what was hidden into your figures. So that's about green ECB, 2% growth of energy demand yearly. That means a doubling of energy consumption around every 30 years, 35 years. So if we continue this for some 300-400 years without even regarding climate change, the climate change problem, the waste energy from this growth will be that high that our oceans will evaporate. It's just not possible. And with regard to your question, Schrödinger, you name it later maybe, what's useful, a useful definition of GDP, maybe we could agree what is not useful. And I think what is not useful to sum to GDP, to add to GDP, is financial Ponzi schemes. They should actually be subtracted from GDP. And I think we'll find a lot of more where we agree.
On your point about labour and so on, one thing, again, this equation, and the version of the Leontief one as well, you can project it back through time and say, where did the energy source come from primarily in ancient civilizations? It was through slavery. If you think about what was the form of energy that the Romans enjoyed, it was the slaves they captured, and they could tell the slaves what to do. The animals they'd take as well. Over time, what we've been doing is replacing machines with labour, because there's a limit to how much energy a human can put into any particular production process. There's no limit to machines, and we're seeing that changing over time. So during that colonial period, definitely, that would be a major source of free energy for the plantations, the rubber plantations, the cotton plantations, etc., etc. Now they're all mechanised, okay? And over time, I think we're going to see that happening more and more. So this raises issues about how we're going to distribute income in the future if the ownership of machines is the main way you get your income. And at some point, from being exploited, labour is going to be excluded. So major issues both in looking at the past but also about the future.
Sorry? I would like to go to the price side. So the idea of finite resources has been with us since the Club of Rome. So, add basically nature or energy as a factor of production. But what about the pricing of these factors of production? So we have the labor share and we have the capital share, like in Piketty. Can our economic system be transformed that we can price the use of the environment appropriately? So we can use the price system to be efficient in our usual economy. So I have to confess to being an economist. So we're always looking to...
You didn't need to.
Looking for that. I mean, there's been all this work by Herman Daly at the World Bank in the 80s already, which tried to merge the ecology and the economy. But the pricing is, I think, the big challenge for our system.
I want to put a conceptual framework around that, and that question is the economy part of the ecology, or is the ecology part of the economy? Now, I think the answer is fairly obvious. And therefore, how could we imagine something which is in the smaller system can control what's in the larger system? My favourite question to anybody who raises the pricing issue is what price of coal is going to stop us melting Antarctica? Now, you won't find that answer in Nordhaus, because in Nordhaus he quite literally says that a 6 degree increase in temperature, this is a paper from 2017, a 6 degree increase in temperature will reduce GDP by 8.5%. I'm glad you're laughing, it's absurd. 6 degrees temperature is the level the planet was at when what's called the Permian extinction, when 93% of life forms disappeared. So there's something seriously wrong with believing a price system alone can do it. Okay? Equally, when you look in terms of ecology and entropy, if you actually priced everything we're consuming, you'd make a loss.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
it's partially, we have to leave out all the costs. If we included all the costs we're imposing, because of the second law, everything would make a loss. So we are always miners. We are always dumping more waste than we actually get all out in that sense. We're producing more waste energy than we actually have energy itself. So the price system works within its domain, which is the market system itself, but it certainly cannot solve the ecological problems.
Can I ask you a short question? So you treat energy as one thing, but consumption of energy is very important. But it doesn't distinguish whether it's green or.
Oh no, it very much have to. You very much have to do that. That's an absolutely vital point.
How do you see it integrating into this?
Well, the trouble is, this is where I haven't done the work I intend doing the work over time. There's a guy called Tim Garrett, who's an atmospheric scientist that I'm working with on trying to incorporate these equations properly within the mathematics of thermodynamics. Tim has calculated that because of that very sharp link between energy and GDP that Alexander mentioned a short while ago, the whole idea of decoupling is based on our theories being wrong about the role of energy. We simply can't decouple without an enormous investment. And Tim's calculations were that we're going to simply stabilise carbon dioxide at its current levels. We would need to be building a new 300 megawatt power station per day for the next 20 years. Now, to actually reduce it, you need to be adding a gigawatt per day for the 300,000 gigawatts per day for the next 15 years to start reducing it. Now, the amount of energy that would take itself causes a problem, because to create it, we'd be using carbon-based energy to do it. So we face an enormous transition problem. And that's why I was focusing upon what happens if energy falls in the future to production. Because if we do find we seriously have to reduce our carbon dioxide output by that much to go from brown energy to green energy, then we're going to have to ration energy for consumption, and on quite a massive scale. So it is vital to do that, but it's future work.
I'd like to add something to that. The question of energy transition and decoupling is an engineering problem. So if you dig a hole into Texas, the oil would come out. You need 1 kilowatt to drill, and 200 to 300 kilowatts will come out. It's the energy harvesting factor. Solar and wind, that we reach a factor from 5 to 10 now. The ITER project in South France, the nuclear fusion, that was the great hope of engineers, actually isn't. Because what they tell us now is that they try to achieve a Q factor of up to 10 within the next decades, and it's all only thermal energy. To convert it to electrical energy, it will be a factor of 5.5, maximum 6, and if you include this large construction, really complicated structure that is needed to build just a 500 megawatt power station, then the actual factor will be 3. So it's less efficient than solar and wind. The problem here is that the share of energy produced and worldwide primary energy. I'm not talking about electrical energy. I'm talking primary energy, including production, household heating, and so on and so forth. The share, solar and wind, is roughly 4%. If we want to extend it to 40% to reduce fossil fuels, then regarding the Q factor and the halving factor of 5 to 10, then we need to burn the rest of the fossil fuels in the earth to achieve that. It's just not possible. We have no technology. That's a problem.
Yeah, there's an area called energy return and energy invested, which I think we can now incorporate in the economics with this vision, and it is a serious challenge. We're going from very, very high energy harvesting out of oil and coal to very low out of solar. Not necessarily as low as those calculations argue, because they often include decommissioning, which nobody ever does. Okay, but certainly it's a challenge to be able to harvest, and according to people doing calculations on what they call the energy cliff, you need about a 5 to 7 to 1 return to the minimum, one unit in, 5 to 7 out, to have even a moderately advanced civilization. So it is a major issue we face in the next 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, in Germany we're currently phasing out of nuclear. We still have scandalous 7 nuclear power plants running. Each of them could, of course, each day blow up. I mean, be aware. However, it was all the time we have been told that nuclear energy is so super cheap, and you were talking about prices. Now we see the price coming to the surface, which is the price for the decommissioning and for the sort of administering the nuclear waste for the next, like, forever, I mean, lifetime. So there comes the price, the real price of this cheap energy. But of course with coal and oil it's the same, because there we have the price for the carbon dioxide and so on.
Actually, I've done my own campaigning against nuclear power stations in my youth, but of those 1,100 people on Patreon, quite a few are engineers, and most of them are saying we have a very warped perception of the safety of nuclear power today and the new technologies that exist, sintering systems and so on. And they're arguing that probably the fastest way to get rid of carbon dioxide pollution, which is the main damage we're doing in the aggregate scale, is with nuclear power plants. Not the ones we're used to, not the water-based ones and so on. So I'm agnostic about it, that's what my engineers are telling me, and I take engineers very seriously.
Just to add to that, I'm very skeptical about nuclear power, because my family is coming from close to Fukushima. But the main problem is the contribution that nuclear power does to world energy supply today is 2%. And so the International Energy Agency suggests to double it to 4%. So we had a major accident every 25 years. So in future we'll probably have a major accident every 12 years, but still we have only 4% contribution to the energy demand nowadays. And if we continue growth, energy demand in 30 years will double. So we building lots of power stations, but we still keep at 2%. That's a problem.
Yeah. There is an enormous energy issue to go from the level of brown technology we use right now to what might be sustainable in the future, and it's a serious potential energy crunch, which economics really hasn't properly considered. And all sorts of issues are raised that we are not experts on. The engineers are the experts. And what they're telling me is the scale of transition is so great that energy rationing almost inevitable in the next 10 to 30 years. Shall I move on to?
Yeah.
It's a big shift in the discussion now, but yes, yeah.
One small remark. There was one regarding GDP. Actually, there was one incident which immediately convinced me that the model which we have, that GDP is really absolutely inappropriate, which was the catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico, where BP was having this catastrophe. And there was an increase of the GDP because of the consequences of the cleaning up and so on.
Yeah.
And you really think, I mean, is that a success for society that we have such a catastrophe?
That's why an objective redefinition in terms of useful work would actually have it as a negative.
I mean, I'm really surprised that we have such an old-fashioned model and use it reasonably still. I mean, then we have to move away from it.
I can't remember the author, but there's a wonderful paper called the GDP Paradox, which points out everybody uses it and nobody likes it. It's about time we did some work to get an improved definition, and I think useful work is the way to clarify that. Okay, so
would you move on to the next?
My second part of the presentation, totally different topic in that sense, and that's looking at the whole, how do we model money and why don't we model money in economics? And if you look at what's called the loanable funds theory of economics, which is the idea that banks are intermediaries between savers and borrowers, the Bank of England came out with the first in 2014 saying this is false. Bank lending creates deposits. They don't need deposits to lend them out, they create them by the act of lending. And in 2017, the Bundesbank, which I was absolutely delighted to see, came out on the same side and said that the creation of book money is straightforward accounting, and this refutes an idea that banks are just intermediaries. Now, also, the money multiplier model, which is another way one might try to say, well, banks do create money, but it's regulated by government rules. The Bank of England also said that doesn't happen either. So we have models of banking which are a part of mainstream education and economics, which are wrong, according to central banks. Not just to rebels like myself now, but actual central banks are saying that. And again, the Bundesbank is saying the same thing. The ability to grow loans has nothing to do with excess reserves. Very, very different to what students are still being taught in economics today. So it's clear that banks don't intermediate. They do originate money and debt. But what are the macroeconomic implications of that? Now, because this idea has just been put forward by central banks, it's just turning up in the literature. And there are two, so far as I'm aware, overlapping generations models. There's one of them by Farah and Gobash, which is the most recent. And the OLG models say there's no particular difference. We might as well continue using the old model because there's no change. They say the only way in which you get a difference is whether there's going to be default. So they say if you can imagine a world without default, you could use the old model. I think that's an absurd idea, but they basically say it all just comes down to whether defaults occur or not. On the other hand, if you look at work like, for example, by Michael Kumhoff with a DSGE model, there's one of two DSGE models I'm aware of. Michael's conclusion was that compared to the otherwise identical intermediation model, financing models, in other words where banks create money, show that there's far larger changes, far faster impacts, far greater changes on the real economy. So I recommend looking at both those papers and saying what on earth is going on here, because obviously they can't both be right. So how do we resolve these two conflicting visions from different models about the nature of banking? I want to show it logically. Start from a logical foundation and say, can we work from the identity of aggregate demand and aggregate income to work out whether credit does or does not have an impact? So I'm going to divide the economy into three sectors and have each one sector send any other two. It could be government, non-government, overseas. It can be manufacturing, services. Doesn't really matter how you divide it up, three sectors. I call this a Moore table in honour of Basil Moore, who was the real champion of what was then called endogenous money back in the 1960s and 70s. And in a Moore table, I'm showing expenditure horizontally and income vertically. So the diagonal shows expenditure by each sector. And each row, because we're showing spending by a sector on the other sectors, each row must sum to zero. That's an absolute given. Now the columns can be non-zero because individual sectoral income can be greater than sectoral expenditure. And I'll look at three monetary arrangements. One where no lending or borrowing is possible, and for the sake of a label I'll call that Say's law. Loanable funds, where lending goes between sectors, and that actually means a transfer of money along the diagonal, as I'll show in a moment. And then what I prefer to call bank-originated money and debt, because the whole term endogenous money is only obvious to those who actually work in the area. Bank-originated money and debt, is I think it's got a great acronym, that's BOND, and it's obvious what you're talking about. And there's a fourth sector, which is the bank that lends to one of the three non-bank sectors, and technically speaking, I should show its assets, but that makes the tables too small to read, so I'm just showing the liability side and the equity side. So here's the idea of Say's law, simply shown as a matrix. And the diagonal is expenditure by each sector. So there's A plus B being spent by sector 1 on sectors 2 and 3. And the income generated is often the off-diagonal elements, A plus B. So that has to sum to zero. And there's income for sector 1, which can be, of course, different to expenditure. Now, when you look at this and say, what is aggregate demand and what is aggregate income, clearly they've got to be equal. That's the identity of the two. And if I describe this as being money in circulation, so money, the stock of money times how often it turns over, then I can take either the trace of the matrix or the off trace and say A plus B out to F is equal to the velocity of money times the stock of money in existence, that's Milton Friedman. So that's Milton Friedman's world. Okay? Now, loanable funds. Well, sector 2 lends to sector 1, and there's a flow of money along the trace of the matrix. And of course, sector 2 has lent to sector 1 to earn interest. So there must be an outstanding stock of debt. And then sector 1 spends on sector 3. Now I can generalise this, but this is without loss of generality. This covers the dynamics I want to take a look at. So now what I have is a flow of credit going from sector 2 to sector 1, and that credit then being spent by sector 1 on sector 3, and then sector 1 is paying interest to sector 2. Do the same analysis, and what you find, this is something I didn't expect to find when I first did this, you now have money times velocity plus gross financial transactions turning up as aggregate income and aggregate expenditure. So that's, credit cancels out though, as you can see, credit's no longer there. So if loanable funds were true, then you could ignore banking in macroeconomics.
That's what they do.
That's what they do. Okay. Now what about where banks are doing the lending? So sector 1 spends the money the bank lends to sector 1 on sector 3. So I've got credit being created, the asset side balances the overall equation. I'm not showing the asset side just because of the scale of the text there. So what do you find? Credit, which is an increase in bank liabilities, is created by an increase in bank assets and then spent by sector 1 on sector 3. And then interest is paid to the bank. And when you do your calculations, credit turns up as part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. This is independent of whether you're looking at whether assets are being purchased as well as goods or services. But of course, in the modern world, most of that money is spent on assets. So if banks originate money in debt, you can't ignore credit in macroeconomics. And the answer to the if is they do. So we have to have credit, banks, debt and money must be part of macroeconomics. And of course, because credit's so volatile, it actually has the major determining impact on the economy, far more so than changes in the velocity of money. So I want to illustrate this using my Minsky software now, which I haven't yet shown you. And what I've done is take the model that Krugman and Eggertson had, a DSGE model, where they had in the supplement, they had a patient consumer goods sector lending to an impatient investment goods sector and the bank charging an intermediation fee. When I put that together in Minsky, and Minsky used a double entry bookkeeping to model the economy, what I'm showing here in the banking sector is reserves are an asset of the banking sector. Loans don't turn up because it's the consumer goods sector lending to the investment goods sector. So the loan is actually an asset of the consumer sector. There's repayment from the investment sector to the consumer sector, interest payments by the investment sector to the consumer sector, a fee being paid by the consumer sector to the bank, hiring of workers, buying of consumption and investment goods, workers' consumption, bankers' investment, and so on. Now that's the basic logic of the model.
The DSGE model?
Pardon?
Of the Krugman.
It's the Krugman model,
yeah,
done using Minsky, so it's actually in a genuine dynamic form. And what I've got here is a time constant by which I can change how fast lending occurs. So basically it says lending roughly doubles the level of debt every 7 years, and has repayment halving the level of debt every 9 years. And if I then simulate this model, what I get is a growth rate of 0. You can see down here the amount of debt is rising, but there's no change in the amount of money. A rising debt to GDP ratio down here, nothing happening on growth, and GDP flatlining at 200. Now if I come over here and I change the level of the rate of speed of lending, so lending happens more quickly, notice the growth rate actually falls. And if I then have repayment happening more slowly, the growth rate falls even more, but it goes back to the same level. You've got a huge increase in the debt to GDP ratio down here. Nothing is happening on GDP worth noting. And then if I go in the reverse direction, so repayment speeds up and lending slows down, You have a plunge in the debt ratio, and again, nothing much happens to the real economy. So with that vision of banking, it's quite legitimate to leave banking out of macroeconomics. Now, what about if we modify it so that it actually includes the reality that banks are creating it? Well, I can do that in Minsky very rapidly by bringing up the consumer sector's double-entry bookkeeping view of the economy and saying, well, it's not correct to say the debt's an asset of the consumer sector. It's an asset of the banking sector. So I can delete that column, delete the lending, debt repayment, interest payment, and bank fee operations, come across to the bank, make room for an extra column, check and see which liabilities don't have an asset attached. The debt is still showing as a liability of the investment sector. Minsky brings across the operations that are still in the system there. I now simply have to say that interest is paid to the bank, and let's get rid of the bank fee. Come back here, I'll reset the system, go back to the original rates of lending I showed you, 7 years to double and 9 years through to halve level of debt. What happens? I've changed nothing else in the model. We now have a positive growth rate, a growing GDP, increasing debts, increasing the money stock. Very different world. If I now speed up lending, you get a boom. The growth rate increases. Slow down repayment. Same story, even more of a boom. And then, if people start repaying debt more rapidly and banks lend more slowly...
You just change the velocity, not the direction.
Yeah, well, just actually the velocity is remaining constant. I'm changing the creation of new credit.
Okay.
That's your explanation for a financial crisis. Okay? That's all I've changed, is acknowledging that banks create money. So it has a huge impact upon macroeconomics. And we have to include it. Otherwise, we're not modelling a capitalist economy. An economy without banks, debt and money is not a capitalist economy. It's a barter system somewhere in the New Guinea highlands that doesn't exist. When you look at what anthropologists have found, if you look at the work of David Graeber on that front, the whole idea of a barter economy has never existed, except in periods of complete social breakdown or in contact between some isolated tribes. So what we've done is ignore, again, an absolutely vital element of capitalism, the role of credit. And this is Ben Bernanke rejecting Fisher's explanation for the Great Depression, which is the debt deflation, on the basis that pure redistributions should have no significant macroeconomic effects. Now, bank lending is not a pure redistribution. It's a mistake to characterise that way, which is the whole loanable funds model. And Fisher understood that. If you read Fisher's Booms and Depressions and First Principles, he mentions, pardon the sexism in the language, but he says a man-to-man debt, okay, may be paid without affecting the volume of outstanding currency. But when you repay a bank debt, the money simply disappears. Okay? Money is destroyed or money is cancelled by repaying a loan. So it's vital at a logical level. What about the statistics? This is now looking at the level of private debt in America, which is the red line. Pardon me, I better go back and show that one properly. That's increasing level of private debt, then a fall. The rate of change of that debt is the rate of creation of new money. That's the rate of growth of credit. And you'll see, when you correlate that with unemployment, rather than getting no significant macroeconomic impact, the correlation coefficient there is minus 0.85. Now this is data that economists have been ignoring. And I've been publishing this data now for going on 12 years. And I still haven't seen anybody say this is an anomaly we need to examine from a mainstream point of view. It's still being ignored. And causation runs from credit to aggregate demand, as I showed in that Moore table earlier, and I find similar results for every major country in the Bank International Settlements database, except one, and that's the one we're in. Okay? Because Germany, with its huge trade surplus and government austerity at the same time, which apparently now has thrown Germany into a recession, it can have low and falling credit usage while still having an increasing amount of money. And that's what's been going on for the last, well, since the formation of the euro, that trend. So Germany is a bad example to try to learn about the rest of the world from. And when I take a look at, and I've done Granger causality work on this too, by the way, or I haven't done, colleagues of mine have. When you look at what causes house price changes, the logical argument comes out that what drives change in house prices is change in mortgage credit, which is acceleration of mortgage debt. And the correlation coefficient there for the US since 1990 is 0.71. That's not a model, it's just saying here's an omitted variable in conventional economics. This is the significance of its relationship with an important entity, which is house price inflation. So we have to bring credit in. How do we go about doing it? Well, Michael Kimoff, who's a very good friend, is trying to do it by doing a micro foundations approach, working from the Kittel and Prescott, etc., DSGE idea that we must derive macro from micro. And of course, the models have excluded money and credit to date. They completely failed to anticipate the crisis, as we all know. So could the work that Dave Michael's doing give us the complete solution? Could it give everything? Well, perhaps, okay? But even speaking with Michael, he said it's a huge amount of work to get to that stage. And we can't treat the financial sector as a source of frictions, because frictions slow down a return to equilibrium. What we're talking about here is propelling you away from equilibrium, causing the bubble beforehand, causing the crash afterwards. It's nonsense to say let's do it with financial frictions. Now, frictions alone can't explain why you diverge in the first place, whereas you can explain it using the logic I've shown you a while ago. So I'm going to suggest an alternative approach, and I'd love to see someone inside the bank, the European Central Bank, take this on and give it a try, because complex systems can give us a guide as to how about building models of the macroeconomy. If you look at where complex system analysis came from, it began with Ed Lorenz's dissatisfaction as a mathematical atmospheric physicist with the pattern matching and the linear weather models we used back in the 1960s. So he took a 12-dimensional model, partial differential equations in 12 dimensions, and broke it down with basically a Taylor series work to a very, very simple 3-variable and 3-parameter model of 2-dimensional turbulence, the sort of thing you can see on your stovetop if you put a soup on a stovetop and look for the little cells that are formed called Rayleigh-Bernay convection cells. So these are the equations. The rate of change of the x location is a times y minus x. The rate of change of the y location of this hypothetical drop of fluid on a hot plate is x times b minus z minus y. And the rate of change of the temperature, that should be z there, the part of it, not x, that should be z. I've got a little error, that's supposed to be z there, not x, I'll fix that later. Is x times y minus c times z. But that's an incredibly simple set of equations, and what it's describing is basically those cells you see forming in soup if you you don't get it boiling too much on the stove. Now, feeding in realistic parameter values, that system has 3 unstable equilibria, and that's what's called the strange attractor. One of the eigenvalue vector pairs attracts along 2 dimensions, repelled upon a third. The other 2 attract along 1 real eigenvalue and repel along 2 complex eigenvalues. And what you get out of it is what's called deterministic aperiodic flow. And I don't know how many of you have ever seen a Lorentz equation running, but you can see how simple those equations are. But the complexity of the behaviour that comes out of the system, and also the structure that lies behind it, is quite remarkable. And that's the basis of the weather models we have today, which, as you know, have dramatically improved their capacity to predict weather a short time in advance over what was common 50 or so years ago. And it's because of embracing complex systems that meteorologists have been able to do this, rather than rejecting them, which is unfortunately what economists did. So, that accurate capacity that meteorologists now have, where they've clearly improved their forecast capability over time, stands in fairly strong contrast to what economists have done. And yet it's a simple top-down model. This is not micro foundations building up, it's a top-down model. There's no modelling of the interaction of individual molecules of fluid, but it's an accurate aggregate model of weather patterns. So could we do a similar thing? Could we work from the aggregate down, not the individual up? And use simple behavioural rules rather than the incredibly complicated rules we do now for maximisation over time and so on. So I'm going to show you can do that, just by taking 3 very simple macroeconomic definitions. The employment rate, lambda equal to L divided by N. No, you can't. That is a definition. That's why I say it's incontrovertible. These are simple definitions. The wages share of GDP, which I call omega, and the debt ratio, which is debt divided by GDP, private debt in this case, of course. Now, if you differentiate with respect to time, you get three dynamic restatements of those definitions. So the employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the growth in labour productivity and population. The wages share of output will rise if wage demands exceed the growth in labour productivity. There's no mention of the Phillips curve there, it's just a definition. And the private debt ratio will rise if debt grows faster than GDP. There's three simple redefinitions now. And that's what they look at, the hat meaning 1 over x dx dt in each of those cases. Employment rate, economic growth, labour productivity growth, population growth, wages share of output, wage demands, growth in labour. That's by the private debt ratio, pardon me. As debt growth exceeds, and that's debt growth. That's what all those equations are. Now, simple relationships can be added to this. I'm going to have output as a linear function of capital. I'll need to change that for energy later, but this is an interim example. Investment a linear function of the profit rate, employment a linear function of output, wage change a linear function of the employment rate, and debt financing investment. Put that together, and these are the equations I'm using. So simple capital output ratio for the output level, investment minus depreciation being the rate of change of the capital stock, a linear Phillips curve, a linear investment function based on the rate of profit, debt financing investment, constant growth in labour productivity and population. Put that all together, and what I get is that very simple model. The red elements are either system states or variables that depend upon system states. Now, if I simulate this model, and I have a low level of desire to invest, then I get a nice smooth convergence to equilibrium over time. And that's, I think, what economists thought they were seeing with the Great Moderation period. And I'll show you why I say that, because if I let this converge, it'll ultimately converge to a fixed point for the rates of growth of all those variables. But if I increase the desire to invest by capitalists to a higher value, which of course you'd want to have capitalists wishing to invest more, so I'm just changing the slope of the investment function here now, and I simulate that again, it looks like the same sort of pattern for a while. You'll notice the cycles are diminishing more rapidly. You'll also notice that workers' share of GDP is falling. Declining wages share, a rising debt ratio meaning increasing bankers' share. So diminishing cycles for a while. But then rising cycles. In a stylized sense, a great moderation followed by a great recession. Now, that incredibly simple model generates two phenomena that economists normally think are two independent phenomena. So even at the most basic level, the absolute stylized model, this is doing better than any conventional economic model which didn't see this coming. And what you get is it has two meaningful equilibria, one which you might call a good outcome with positive employment rate, positive wages share and a constant private debt ratio. That's that particular one, as I've just shown you a while ago, going further. This is when you keep on going with a high propensity to invest. You finally get a breakdown. Now, of course, there are huge cycles in employment, huge cycles in wages share, which you don't actually see in the real world. But if you simply change the linear equation either with non-linear, then you get more realistic compression of those values. The non-linear behaviour is not there to give you non-linear dynamics, it's to constrain the actual dynamics to be closer to what we see in the real world. And you can extend further to include price dynamics as well. This is the model with prices included there as well. Again, it's an absolutely basic model. Okay? There's much, much further to go, but this I think is far more promising than what's been happening with mainstream economic theory, to get to the stage where I can generate both the Great Moderation and the Great Recession. And I did actually, I wrote that model in August of 1992, before either phenomena had occurred. So we might learn more by modelling the structure of the economy accurately, using macroeconomic definitions to guide us, than we'll do by trying to fine-tune our attempts to model the behaviour of agents in that system, which is what economics is dominated by now. So I think we should abandon general equilibrium and go to general dynamics. And we now have the tools to do this, which didn't exist 50 or so years ago, but are quite common now. And students of mine have been using this technology to develop quite sophisticated models. This is my favourite so far, my two favourites, are this one. That is a model of the Portuguese economy, done by a master's student who's now doing a PhD with me. He works for the Portuguese Statistical Agency. And I'll wait till that model comes up. This is a 5-sectoral view of the Portuguese economy. Now, I wouldn't want to try to reading that right now. There's lots of ways I want to improve the interface, but that model is more accurate in out-of-sample forecasting than either the Treasury's model or the central bank's model of the Portuguese economy.
But it's done by Pedro, a student.
Yeah. And another one, so that guy works for the, Pedro works for the Statistical Agency in Portugal. This is by another student of mine just recently employed by the Bank of England to do work on shadow banking for them. And that's a stylised model of the shadow banking sector. So you can build quite sophisticated models in the software already, and it's got a long way to go before it reaches all the power that I want to see it develop. But it's possible to do dynamic, non-equilibrium monetary modelling, including energy, today, and I think we should start doing it. Thank you.
Well, that was a lot of mathematics. Any questions? Or comments?
Yeah.
3 short questions, maybe long answers.
I'll take them down because the 3 questions thing, always you forget the first one, but by the time you get the
I'll
last
stop
2.
at the first.
Okay, here we go.
In many circles, in general, when comparing the United States financial system with the European financial system, it's said that the United States is market-based and European is bank-based. That there's a lot more of funding coming directly from the market. So there's the stock market, the bond market, and therefore banks are not so important in the United States. While in Europe, funding is directed mainly from banks to companies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the end, we had a huge banking crisis coming from the United States. How can it be explain this dual view of financial systems?
I think the dual view is wrong. I think it's you have a lot of detail obscuring what's happening in the background. This is another software package I'm designing right now I call Revel, but that's showing the level of private debt in America. You can see the rise and decline in private debt through the crisis. That's the level of credit, which was positive all the way through the post-war period until the financial crisis. This is all bank debt I'm looking at here. Mm-hmm. This is the change in credit, and you can see the plunge that caused the Great Recession. This is the employment rate, and I think you can see the correlation is pretty overwhelming. Now, if I do the same thing, I'll go and take a look at the situation for, let's go for Spain. That's a good one to use. I'll just use the other way to choose. Let's see, Spain. There's Spain. I need to make the top a bit higher for Spain's level of private debt. But I think you can see exactly the same dynamics. Okay, we're letting ourselves be obscured by we're letting the trees get in the way of seeing the forest. So fundamentally, they're both driven by the banking sector. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of bonds and market-based things is banks evading regulation to do that. It's still, in both cases, a banking-based system. Okay?
Would you please keep your question in mind? Just one question of mine. If you modeling debt and credit with change of debt, then you're always speaking of private debt. So governments and central banks and the EU Commission and all politicians are always very concerned with government debt.
Yep.
Would you please elaborate on that a bit?
I think that's
Why do you model private debt?
I do model them both, but when I model government debt, it becomes a stabiliser in the economy rather than a destabilising factor.
That's a
What I was going to do right now is, I've got to set this on first of all. There's a couple of changes I need to make to my software setting here. Let's see. So I want to just show, say, general government and private sector debt. Hoping the software won't crash. This is brand new software. Okay. Now come back and compare the two. What you see, I'll just turn off the labelling because it's a bit obscuring the information. That's supposed to be another engine. Oh, that's happening. Okay. You can see behind this, there's private debt exploding while government debt fell before the crisis. When the crisis hits and the rate of change of private debt goes low, government debt rises. So government debt actually plays the role of a stabiliser in the economy. And the rules of the Maastricht Treaty mean that stabiliser doesn't kick in and can't kick in hard enough to stabilise the economy. So I think that's a major reason why Europe has got twice the level of unemployment America has after the financial crisis, because it's basically turned off the air conditioning system. I can be more elaborate than that, but government debt is not the problem, except when you have a country that doesn't have its own currency, and that, of course, is the Eurozone.
Of course, you're here in a central bank that at least traditionally has always argued that money matters in the spirit of the Bundesbank and the monetarist tradition. Now, that was a gross simplification, that tradition, Friedman. But the simplification you are now proposing, which is banks can create credit out of thin air, money out of thin air by credit. This is also simplification. And if people like Martin Hellwig have criticized the Ben Ringen article and others, because the capacity to lend of a bank depends on its entire balance sheet, on its equity, on its leverage. So it is a simplification, just to not go from one oversimplification to another oversimplification. I think it's still a big improvement over the loanable funds, which is at the heart of all this DG modeling, typically in the Keynesian tradition. So but just as a caveat, not to oversimplify perhaps that thin air kind of approach. And then my question is, how does your modeling, which you label Minsky, compared to Godley-Lavoie, which is very similar, which is a stock flow consistent modeling, where I think they pay much more attention, in a way, at least in your talk, to the balance sheet variables, so the stocks as opposed to the flows, and of course the relationship between the stock and the flow dynamics. It's probably more the background in your case.
Mark is a very good friend, and we're very compatible in our economics. The major difference is Mark continues working in discrete time, and I think that's the wrong framework. Discrete time. T and T minus 1. You never do it properly. It's the wrong framework anyway. I prefer continuous time modelling. But all that work is stock flow consistent. So if you look at the Godley table, which I haven't really actually explained in great detail here. So this is all stock flow consistent modelling. So if you look at what the Godley table does, and you can see the scale of this one done by Pedro for the financial system in Portugal, what it makes sure, and it's happening over here, is that the assets minus liabilities minus equity must equal 0 in all those rows. So that's actually doing the logical check for stock flow consistent modelling as per Godley and Lavoie.
Just one weakness and a limit to just taking the engineering approach is, of course, we are a social science, economics. So behavior is driven by expectations. So one criticism of this approach is that you don't have the feedback from expectations into behavior. Of course, using rules of thumb, but that's a criticism I always hear from my colleagues.
I think it's an exaggerated criticism, because what we have in terms of supposed feedback from expectations, where you look at how rational expectations are defined, fundamentally, fundamentally it's saying we can predict the future. If you look at the definition of rational expectations from Muth on, and particularly in the area of finance, you'll find ultimately Fama in French saying that the Sharpe's idea that people have the same expectations, which is part of forming the capital asset pricing model, is not just that we have the same expectations, it's also the expectations are correct. Now that is not, in my opinion, modelling expectations properly. And Keynes's idea about expectations is that it's fundamentally different to risk. You can give a probability, and we use probability all the time. When you have an uncertain future, people, as Keynes argued, tend to extrapolate what's happening now forward. And that's what I'm doing in all my modelling here. I simply say people extrapolate current conditions, and they extrapolate what they know. So the workers extrapolate the employment rate, capitalists extrapolate the profit rate. That's really what we do. And I think our modelling of expectations is a fallacy. Okay? Even though expectations are part of it, the way we do it is by eliminating them, by saying, oh, we use the same model to make our expectations that we have in economics. And that model is correct, and therefore our expectations are correct, therefore they cancel out government. It is a fallacy. And I think we need to make a much more sensible definition of expectations than has been done in economic theory. And fundamentally, it comes back to the stage where rule of thumb behaviour is pretty much what people do, and if you put that into the model, I get results like we see in the real world.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there is a process in which debt grows. No? There is a moment in which there is a growth of that. Then at some stage, for X reasons, or traditionally it was said because the end of the cycle, then this debt becomes bad, no? Non-performing.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have said the public expenditure, so public debt kicks in and contributes to compensate this, but then this non-performing debt is still with the banks.
Mm. Yep.
There are two things that you can do with it. One of them is to take it out of the banks and put it with a public entity, like the US did, a lot of bad debt of the banks was put with the
to do a more...
Or
yeah.
you put it kind of on the shoulders of the citizens, which is what the avenue which was taken in Spain.
I would rather put it on the shoulders of the central bank.
That's the easiest
Because the
thing to
central
do.
bank has got the capacity to create the money, as we all know from quantitative easing, but it's been used to prop up the financial sector rather than to prop up the real economy. So once you acknowledge that we can have excessive private debt, and we've let that happen, and in my opinion we have probably 3 to 4 times the level of private debt the economy actually needs to finance investment and finance large consumption items, we have to get rid of it, and we could use the central bank's capacity to do that quite easily. In the same way that, I don't know the figures for the European Central Bank as well as I do for the Fed, but the Fed's created roughly $1 trillion of money per year since the financial crisis until about a year ago to prop up the financial sector. If it created that $1 trillion per year to cancel private debt and make sure it didn't benefit just the borrowers but benefited people who are savers as well, I think we'd be out of the financial crisis completely, because we would have reduced that level of private debt back to what it should be, which is about 50 to 75% of GDP, whereas in America's case it was 170, now it's 150. In most of Europe it's about 200, some parts of Europe it's 250% of GDP. So we don't have to put it on the shoulders of the taxpayers, we can put it on the shoulders of the central bank.
But you have the rules, you know.
Of course, if we do put it on the shoulders of the taxpayers, then we get deflation. And that's what we're seeing, what's starting in Europe.
Sorry, just one comment. And where is moral hazard in
That's
this?
right.
Where is the aspect of moral hazard in this last?
I've been arguing for what I call a modern debt jubilee for about 10 years now. And the idea of a modern debt jubilee is that both private banks and the central bank can create money. Okay? We've let too much money creation occur with the private banks. We have far too much private debt, and that's what's causing the economy to be stagnant. If the central bank created money and gave it out to citizens on a per capita basis, independent of whether they are in debt or not, then you don't benefit those who get their debt cancelled without also benefiting those who have no debt at all. They both get a cash injection. Now with those who are in debt, you could use it as a debt offset account would solve some of the technical problems in how one cancels debt. But anybody who gets has debt, gets a debt offset. It reduces the debt burden for them, the effective debt burden. Anybody who doesn't have debt gets a cash injection. We could also control the cash injection and say that must be used to buy corporate shares, which the corporate shares must be used to reduce corporate debt. And then what you get is a democratisation of share ownership, which is the opposite of what QE has done, which of course has benefited those who own assets by increasing asset prices, and effectively made worse off those who don't own those assets, which I think is what's leading to things like the Gilets jaunes protests in France, the inequality that central banks have actually caused through the QE process. With the modern debt jubilee, we could reverse that, make it more, take away the damage that QE for the banks has done, make it QE for the people, but make sure it doesn't benefit those who speculated versus those who didn't by making it a per capita thing, and use it also to cancel levels of corporate debt and therefore democratise share ownership to some extent, again in reverse of what we've actually done.
Trying to go where you wanted to go is if you say there's too much private debt creation, then exactly the expectation of people that the central bank will bail them out or the government will actually take over the debt and cancel the debt will lead to even higher debt creation.
In which case we have to change what banks lend for.
Exactly. So you have to have a systemic change.
And I would like what banks have fundamentally been doing is lending to finance asset price inflation. That's what they've been doing. Okay, so what we have to do is change the rules around which we let banks lend. And I would again have one other proposal I put forward. I call the property income limited leverage, or the PIL. Used to make more sense 30 years ago than it does now. But the PIL would mean that the maximum amount that could be lent against a property would be set by the actual or imputed rental income that property could earn. And the factor might be, say, 10. So you'd say if a property rents for €20,000 per year, then the maximum loan anybody could get would be €200,000 per year. And then people who are competing over that property would have, the winner would be the one who saves more money, not the one who gets higher leverage. Whereas at the moment, if you're competing over a property, the winner is the one who gets the higher leverage. So that would remove the incentive we all have to want to have higher leverage. And that, I think, is essential to stop banks just financing asset bubbles. But at the same time, banks, we'd like them to lend to entrepreneurs, but if they lend to entrepreneurs, 5 times out of 6 they'll lose money, and large amounts of money. So I'd rather also let banks lend and take equity positions, in a way blending venture capital with banking. And then we'd have money creation which would actually be for the sake of innovation, which is the major argument capitalism has in its favour, and our banking system is not financing innovation. So it's not just one little change, the whole range of changes would need to happen. But I think with that we could have a financial sector which is not as destabilising as the financial sector currently is, and that's, I think, the major challenge we face working in the financial sector, is stopping it being destabilising and causing crises, which is what it's doing right now.
Sorry, just one comment. How's that more fair, your proposal, when you say there is a required investment in equity, for example? Because then only companies, corporates who are listed would benefit and these shareholders would benefit. But the others who aren't shareholders will not benefit, and particularly those companies who are not listed will not benefit. How is that more fair than QE?
Well, what I was talking about is using, in terms of the modern debt jubilee, you'd use, everybody who has a bank account would get a cash injection independent of whether they're shareholders or not. Yeah. Okay.
And then you say, and are required to invest some of that money in corporates, right? Equity.
Well, if you look at the level of corporate debt, and that's another issue that's extremely important. It isn't just households that have too much debt. The corporate sector has also taken on too much debt. And a lot of it's used for mortgage and mergers and acquisitions, effectively wasteful uses of money, and share buybacks and so on. We need to reduce that corporate debt as well as household debt. So one way to go about it would be to require people who got money on a per capita household basis to buy shares, which the corporations would have to use to cancel their private debt as well. So it's a way to both reduce the level of corporate debt, reduce household debt, and increase the ownership of shares.
How do you say you have to invest your private debt into which corporation and then have that corporation
pension schemes and superannuation schemes are doing that right now.
But I mean, it's up to every company to decide what to do with the money. But if you say, okay, this is earmarked to debt, then still shareholders will benefit from that. How is that?
Shareholders wouldn't benefit. The existing shareholders would suddenly find they have new shareholders joining the company. If anything, you'd see share prices fall. And I think share prices have to fall. They're also exaggerated. They've been driven up by leverage. The level of share prices reflects far too much debt leverage through margin loans and so on, and I can show you the empirical data on that as well. So we've got massively overinflated asset prices benefiting those who own assets right now, not benefiting those who don't. We have to pull ourselves out of that mess in general, and it isn't just a simple resolution. It's not straightforward. I'm not saying I've got a instant cure-all for everything, but there's a range of factors that are necessary to reduce the damage the financial sector does to the real economy right now, and to reduce the damage we've done by increasing inequality through the attempt to get out of a financial crisis that central banks didn't see coming.
Yeah, but I fail to see how that is more democratically legitimized and fairer to the society than what is going on at the moment.
Well, we have to have a conversation over coffee perhaps, but I think it's much fairer because the QE has benefited those who currently own shares, and that isn't the working class. And they're the ones who are rioting in the streets of Paris and the rest of France.
That's what I would suggest, because we have the room only quarter an hour. So I would suggest that you join us now for coffee or something to eat. Because I really like the conversation and it's really important.
Definitely clarification. I think I disagree with you. I think my proposal is much more democratic than what we're doing right now, but it's foreign at the same time to what we're doing right now. So obviously there can be reasons why you might interpret it differently. To me, it's much more democratic than what we're doing right now. And if we don't have an increase in democracy, we're going to get an increase in totalitarianism, as I think we're seeing all over the planet.
Thank you very much for your patience and for your contribution to the talk. And I would like to close it with one of my favorite sayings, and this is: the economy is far too important to leave it to the economists. Thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you.